Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Emma's Stories, the place where hopeless romantics like you and me come to dive into tales of love that make our hearts skip a beat. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Today, we're stepping into a world where a single spilled cup of coffee changes everything. This is the story of Grace Mitchell, a small-town barista with a heart bigger than her paycheck, and Liam Donovan, a billionaire who thought he'd locked his emotions away forever. It's a journey from chaos to love, from self-doubt to discovery, and I promise you won't want to look away. So grab your favorite drink, maybe a coffee, and let's get started. Oh, and before we begin, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'd love to know. Picture this: a rainy morning in Seattle, where the air smells like wet pavement and roasted coffee beans. Grace Mitchell stands behind the counter of Brew and Bloom, a tiny coffee shop with chipped mugs and wooden tables that wobble if you lean too hard. She's 24, with messy brown hair tied back in a loose ponytail, wearing a faded green t-shirt and an apron stained with espresso. She grew up in a cramped apartment, raised by a single mom who worked 3 jobs until she got sick and left Grace alone too soon. Now, Grace pours coffee to pay off old medical bills, her dreams tucked away in a box she doesn't dare open. She tells herself every day, keep your head down, don't mess up, this is all you've got. Across the country, in a glass tower in New York, Liam Donovan sits at the top of Donovan Ventures, a billion-dollar investment firm. He's 30 with sharp blue eyes and a jawline that could cut glass, always dressed in a tailored suit that costs more than Grace's rent for a year. Liam built his empire from the ground up, but success came with a price. Years ago, his first love betrayed him, selling his startup secrets to a rival. And since then, he's kept everyone at arm's length. His days are a blur of meetings and numbers, his heart a vault no one can crack. He doesn't believe in second chances, not anymore. But fate has a funny way of ignoring plans. On this particular morning, Liam's in Seattle for a last-minute business deal. He's stressed, his tie is too tight, and he needs caffeine before facing a room full of investors. He pushes open the door to Brew and Bloom, the bell jingling above him, and steps inside. Grace, juggling too many orders, doesn't notice him at first. She's rushing, her hands shaky from a sleepless night, when Liam barks his order, "Espresso black, make it quick." His voice is cold, clipped, the kind that makes people jump. Grace nods, fumbling with the machine, her nerves buzzing. Then it happens. She turns too fast, the steaming cup slips from her fingers and hot coffee splashes across Liam's hand and down his pristine white shirt. He gasps, more from shock than pain, and snaps, "Do you have any idea who I am?" Grace freezes, her face turning red, her heart pounding like it's about to burst. She drops to her knees, grabbing a rag to wipe the floor, stammering, "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to, I swear. Please don't tell my boss." Tears prick her eyes, not because of the coffee, but because this job is her lifeline, and she's terrified she's just lost it. Liam towers over her, ready to unleash his frustration, but then he sees her trembling hands, hears the crack in her voice as she whispers, "I can't lose this. It's all I have." For a moment, time stops. Liam's anger fades, replaced by something he can't name. Her vulnerability, her raw honesty, it hits him like a punch. He's used to people bowing to him, fearing him, but this girl, this stranger, makes him feel exposed instead. Grace looks up, her hazel eyes wide and wet, and says, "I'll make you another one, no charge, I promise." Liam doesn't move. He just stares, his mind racing. Who is she, he wonders. And that's where our story begins. So there they were, Grace on her knees, scrubbing coffee off the floor of Brew and Bloom, and Liam standing over her, his hand still stinging from the spill. Most people would have stormed out or demanded her job, but Liam didn't. He couldn't explain it then, but something about Grace's panicked apology stuck with him. Her voice, soft and shaky, wasn't like the polished excuses he heard every day from boardroom suits. It was real. He muttered, "Forget it," and left without his espresso, his mind spinning as he walked into the rain. Grace watched him go, her heart sinking. Great, she thought. I just ruined my life in front of a guy who looks like he owns half the city. Little did she know, he kind of did. The next day, Liam couldn't focus. Meetings blurred together, numbers danced on his laptop, but all he could see was that girl with the messy ponytail and tear-streaked face. He kept replaying her words. It's all I have. He'd spent years building walls around himself, shutting out anything that felt too human, too messy. But Grace, in 10 chaotic seconds, had slipped through a crack he didn't know existed. By noon, he found himself back at Brew and Bloom. Grace was behind the counter, wiping mugs, her apron still smudged from yesterday. She looked up, saw him, and dropped a spoon. "Oh no, not you again," she blurted, then clapped a hand over her mouth. Liam raised an eyebrow, almost amused. "Relax," he said. "I'm not here to sue you." He slid a business card across the counter. Liam Donovan, it read, followed by CEO Donovan Ventures. Grace stared at it, her stomach flipping. "If you ever need a better job, call me," he said, his tone flat but his eyes lingering on her a second too long. Then he turned and left. Grace held the card like it was a winning lottery ticket, her mind racing. A job? Me? With a guy like that? She shoved it into her pocket, figuring it was a pity offer she'd never use. But life had other plans. A week later, Brew and Bloom's owner announced they were shutting down. No more rent money, no more coffee. Grace stood in the empty shop that night, the lights flickering, and pulled out Liam's card. With shaky fingers, she dialed. Liam picked up on the second ring. "Yes?" His voice was crisp, businesslike. Grace stumbled over her words. "Hi, it's Grace, the girl who, spilled coffee on you. You said something about a job?" There was a pause, and she swore she heard a faint chuckle. "Be at my office tomorrow, 9 sharp, he said. "New York?" she squeaked. "Unless you know another Donovan Ventures," he replied, and hung up. Grace spent the night packing her one suitcase, her heart pounding with fear and a tiny spark of hope. She caught a bus to New York, arriving at his skyscraper in a wrinkled sweater, her sneakers squeaking on the marble floor. The receptionist smirked, but Grace squared her shoulders and thought, "I've got nothing to lose." Liam's office was a world apart from Brew and Bloom. Glass walls, sleek furniture, a view of the city that made Grace dizzy. He sat behind a massive desk, looking every bit the billionaire in his dark suit. "You're late," he said, glancing at his watch. "The bus broke down," she mumbled, clutching her bag. He studied her, expecting her to fidget or apologize more, but she just met his gaze, tired but defiant. "Well, me?" she asked suddenly. "You could hire anyone." Liam leaned back, caught off guard. "You're honest," he said after a moment. "I don't get much of that around here." He offered her a temporary assistant gig, just to fill in for someone on leave. Grace nodded, too stunned to argue. Her first day was a disaster. She knocked over a stack of files, got lost delivering a memo, and accidentally called Liam Mr. Coffee in front of his team. Everyone laughed, except Liam. He watched her scramble to pick up papers, her cheeks red, and felt something shift inside him. She wasn't polished or poised, but she was alive in a way his world wasn't. That night, he found her at the coffee machine, trying to figure it out. "Need help?" he asked, stepping closer. Grace jumped, spilling grounds on the counter. "I'm hopeless," she groaned. Liam took the scoop from her hand, their fingers brushing, and made her a cup. "You're not hopeless," he said quietly. "You're just different." Grace sipped the coffee, her eyes widening. "You're good at this," she said. "Why don't you smile more?" Liam froze, the question hitting harder than it should. "I don't have much to smile about," he admitted, his voice low. Grace tilted her head, studying him. "That's sad," she said simply. "You've got everything." He looked at her, really looked, and thought, maybe I didn't. Until now, over the next few days, she kept showing up with her clumsy energy, leaving sticky notes with doodles on his desk, bringing him burnt cookies she'd made in the break room. "For the coffee guy," she'd say, grinning. Liam kept every note, every crumb, tucking them away like secrets. He started noticing things. How her laugh echoed in the sterile halls, how she hummed off-key while filing papers. He'd catch himself staring, his chest tight, wondering why this girl, of all people, made him feel so unsteady. One afternoon, she tripped carrying a tray of water, soaking his shoes. "I'm so sorry," she gasped, dropping to wipe them. Liam knelt too, stopping her hands. "It's just water," he said softly. Their eyes locked, and for the first time in years he smiled. A real one, not the practiced kind he used in meetings. Grace blinked, then smiled back. "You should do that more," she whispered, and in that moment Liam knew he was in trouble, the best kind of trouble. Grace Mitchell was now a fixture at Donovan Ventures, a splash of color in Liam Donovan's gray world. She didn't belong there, not really, with her scuffed sneakers and coffee-stained sweater, but that's exactly why she mattered. Every day she stumbled through tasks, leaving chaos in her wake, and every day Liam found himself watching her a little longer. He'd built his life on control, every move calculated, every risk measured, but Grace was a wild card, unpredictable, and he couldn't stop thinking about her. He told himself it was curiosity, nothing more. "She's just an employee," he'd mutter, staring at the doodle of a coffee cup she'd left on his desk. But deep down, he knew better. It started small. One morning, Grace showed up with a paper bag, her cheeks pink from the cold. "I made these," she said, plopping it on his desk. Inside were cookies, lumpy and slightly burnt, but the smell of cinnamon hit him like a memory he couldn't place. "They're not fancy," she added, "but I figured you might need a break from all the serious stuff." Liam hesitated, then took one. It crumbled in his hand, and he bit into it, expecting nothing. Instead, it was warm, sweet, imperfect, and it made his chest ache. "Not bad," he said, his voice softer than usual. Grace beamed. "Told you I'm not totally useless." He looked at her, crumbs on his tie, and thought, "You're more than you know." She kept doing things like that. She'd hum while sorting mail, filling the silence he'd grown used to. She'd leave him coffee with little notes. "Don't work too hard, Mr. Coffee." He'd roll his eyes, but he drank every cup, saving the notes in a drawer he never opened for anyone else. One evening, he found her in the break room, trying to fix the toaster she'd jammed with a bagel. "This thing hates me," she groaned, smacking it. Liam walked over, unplugged it, and pulled out the charred remains. "You're a disaster," he said, but there was no edge to it. Grace laughed, brushing flour off her hands. "Yeah, but I'm your disaster now, right?" He didn't answer, but his heart said yes. Liam started changing, and he didn't even notice at first. He'd linger after meetings, asking her dumb questions just to hear her talk. "How do you make coffee taste good?" he'd say, and she'd ramble about beans and brewing until he forgot why he'd asked. His staff noticed too. "You're smiling more," his VP said one day. Liam shrugged it off, but it was true. Grace had this way of pulling him out of himself, like sunlight through a crack in a wall. He'd catch her tripping over cords or spilling pens, and instead of annoyance, he felt something warm, something alive. "I've been dead inside too long," he thought one night, staring at the city lights. "And she's waking me up." Then came the product launch. Donovan Ventures was unveiling a new app, a big deal with investors watching. Liam's assistant was out sick, so he threw Grace into the deep end. "Just hand out the folders," he said. "Don't talk, don't improvise." She nodded, but of course it went wrong. She tripped on the stage steps, folders flying, and landed in a heap. The room gasped, then fell silent. Grace scrambled up, her face red, and grabbed the mic. "Well, hi everyone," she said, laughing nervously. "I'm Grace, and I guess I'm here to make sure you're awake for this amazing app, which, I haven't crashed yet." The crowd chuckled, then clapped. Liam backstage put a hand to his forehead, but he was grinning. She kept going, fumbling through a pitch she barely understood, pointing at the screen with lines like, "This button does something cool, trust me." It was a mess, but it worked. Investors loved her, posting clips online with captions like, "The clumsiest spokesperson we adore." By the end, she'd turned a disaster into a win. Liam found her after, sitting on a crate, kicking her feet. "I told you not to talk," he said, crossing his arms. "Yeah, but I saved it, didn't I?" she shot back, grinning. He nodded. You did. And in his head, he added, You save me every day. That night, he offered her a permanent job. You're good for this place, he said, meaning more than he let on. Grace tilted her head. You sure? I break everything. Liam looked at her, serious now. Not everything. She stayed, and with every day she carved a space in his life he hadn't known was empty. He started seeking her out, not just for coffee or cookies, but for her. One afternoon, they got stuck in the elevator together. Grace panicked, pressing buttons while Liam leaned against the wall, calm. We're fine, he said. She glared. Easy for you to say, Mr. Billionaire. I'm not made for tiny boxes. He stepped closer, steadying her. You're made for more than you think. The air shifted. Grace stopped fidgeting, her breath catching as she looked up at him. His hand lingered on her arm, and for a second, neither moved. The elevator jolted back to life, breaking the moment. But it was too late. Liam felt it, that pull he'd been fighting. I don't do this, he thought, stepping back. I don't let people in. But Grace wasn't just people. She was chaos and kindness, laughter and light. And he couldn't shake her. Later, alone in his office, he pulled out one of her notes, tracing the sloppy handwriting. She's breaking me open, he whispered to the empty room. And I don't want her to stop. Grace felt it too, though she wouldn't admit it. She'd catch him watching her, his blue eyes softer than they should be, and her stomach would flip. He's my boss, she'd tell herself, scrubbing counters harder to drown it out. But at night, in her tiny apartment, she'd replay those moments. His smile, his voice, the way he'd knelt to help her with spilled water. He's too good for me, she'd think, staring at the ceiling. Guys like him don't fall for girls like me. But every time he said her name, every time he stayed a little longer, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she was wrong. And that wonder, that tiny spark of hope, kept her going back. Things were shifting at Donovan Ventures, and Grace Mitchell was at the heart of it. Liam Donovan couldn't deny it anymore. She was changing him. Her clumsy steps, her burnt cookies, her off-key humming, they'd slipped into his life like a melody he didn't know he needed. He'd catch himself smiling at her doodles, replaying her laugh in his head long after she'd left the room. But just when he started to let his guard down, the past came knocking, and it wasn't gentle. Enter Rachel Hayes, Liam's ex-girlfriend, a woman who'd once held his heart and crushed it without blinking. Rachel strode into the office one sunny afternoon, heels clicking like a countdown. She was stunning, all sharp cheekbones and designer silk, her blonde hair falling in perfect waves. Grace was at her desk, a repurposed corner by the copier, sorting mail when Rachel swept past. "Where's Liam?" Rachel demanded, not even glancing at her. Grace fumbled a stack of envelopes. In his office, I think?" Rachel smirked, eyeing Grace's stained apron. "Cute. Stay out of my way, coffee girl." Grace bristled but bit her tongue, thinking, who does she think she is? She didn't know yet, but she'd find out soon enough. Inside Liam's office, Rachel didn't waste time. "We need to talk," she said, tossing her purse on his desk. Liam looked up, his jaw tightening. "Rachel, what do you want?" She leaned in, voice smooth as poison. "You've been avoiding me, Liam. After everything we built together, you owe me more than silence." He stood, keeping the desk between them. "We built nothing. You sold me out, remember?" Years ago, Rachel had betrayed him, leaking his startup plans to a competitor for a payout. He'd ended it then, but she'd lingered in his business world, a partner he couldn't fully shake. Now she was back, and her timing was no accident. Grace, being Grace, couldn't resist eavesdropping. She hovered by the door with a stack of files she didn't need, ear pressed close. "She's using that girl," Rachel said, her voice dripping disdain. "That little barista you've got trailing you like a lost puppy. People are talking, Liam. They think she's after your money." Liam's voice hardened. "Grace isn't like that." Rachel laughed, sharp and cold. "Oh, please, she's a nobody playing Cinderella. You're smarter than this." Grace's stomach dropped. She backed away, files slipping to the floor. A nobody, she whispered, her chest tight. Is that what he thinks, too? The words stuck with her all day. She avoided Liam, burying herself in busy work, her mind spinning. I don't belong here, she thought, staring at her reflection in the break room mirror. I'm just a broke girl who spills stuff. He's a billionaire. This was a mistake. That night she wrote a letter, her handwriting shaky. Liam, thanks for everything, but I'm not cut out for this. I don't want your pity. Grace. She left it on his desk and walked out, her sneakers silent on the marble floor. When Liam found it the next morning, his heart stopped. He read it twice, then crumpled it in his fist. She's gone, he thought, and the emptiness hit him harder than he'd expected. Rachel saw her chance. She cornered Liam at a board meeting, all smiles and strategy. Let's announce a new partnership, she said. You and me, like old times. It'll shut down the rumors about your little coffee fling. Liam stared at her, his mind elsewhere. No, he said flatly. Rachel blinked. What? He stood, voice low. I don't care about rumors. I care about her. He walked out, leaving Rachel fuming. She wasn't done, though. She spread whispers through the company. Grace was a gold digger, a charity case Liam pitied. By lunchtime, the gossip reached Grace's old co-workers in Seattle, and one called her. They're saying you're using him, they said. Grace hung up, tears burning. I'd never, she whispered. I just wanted to be enough. Liam couldn't let it go. He tracked her down to her tiny apartment, banging on the door until she opened it, eyes red. Why'd you leave? He asked, rain dripping from his coat. Grace crossed her arms. Because I heard her. I'm a nobody, Liam. I don't fit in your world. He stepped closer, voice breaking. You heard wrong. You're not a nobody to me. She shook her head. You don't get it. I've got nothing, no money, no class. I'm a mess. Liam grabbed her hands, his grip firm. You're the only real thing in my life, Grace. I don't want class. I want you. She pulled away, trembling. What about her? Rachel, she's your past, your equal. I can't compete with that. Liam's eyes darkened. She's nothing to me. She broke me once, but you're putting me back together. I didn't see it until you were gone. Grace stared at him, her heart pounding. I don't know how to trust this, she said, voice small. I've never been enough for anyone. Liam stepped into her space, rain soaking the floor. You're enough for me. More than enough. He pulled her close, and she let him, her tears mixing with the wet on his shirt. But Rachel wasn't finished. She dug up an old contract, a deal tying her family's firm to Donovan Ventures. If Liam didn't play nice, she'd sue, risking jobs, including Grace's. She confronted him at the office, smirking. Marry me or lose everything, she said. Liam laughed, cold and sharp. I'd rather lose it all than lose her again. That night, he called a press conference, Grace by his side. Cameras flashed as he took her hand. I'm here to set things straight, he said. Grace Mitchell isn't a fling or a mistake. She's the best thing that's ever happened to me, and if anyone tries to tear us down, they'll have to go through me first. Grace's breath caught. She looked at him, his jaw set, his grip steady, and felt something shift. He means it, she thought, her heart swelling. The crowd murmured, some cheered, but all she heard was him. I thought I wasn't worth fighting for, she whispered later, alone with him. Liam brushed her hair back, his touch gentle. You're worth everything, Grace. I just had to figure that out. She smiled, small but real, and leaned into him. The storm wasn't over, but for the first time, she believed they could weather it together. Grace Mitchell stood in Liam Donovan's arms that rainy night, her doubts still swirling, but his words echoing louder. You're worth everything, he'd said, and she wanted to believe him. She'd spent her life feeling small, invisible, a girl who spilled coffee and scraped by. But with Liam, she felt seen, maybe even needed. The press conference had shaken her, his public stand for her replaying in her mind. Yet Rachel Hayes loomed like a shadow, her threat to sue Donovan Ventures hanging over them. Grace knew this wasn't just about her job or his company. It was about them. about proving she could stand by his side, not just hide behind it. The next morning, Grace woke with a fire she hadn't felt before. She stared at her cracked ceiling thinking, I've run from everything my whole life. Not this time. She pulled on her old sweater, grabbed her bag, and headed back to Donovan Ventures. Liam was in a meeting, his face tense as lawyers debated Rachel's contract. Grace slipped in, unnoticed at first, clutching a USB drive she'd dug up from her things. She'd remembered something. A late night at Brew and Bloom months ago when Rachel had stopped by with a client. Grace had been cleaning, half listening, but her phone had recorded it, all by accident. She waited until Rachel strutted in, all confidence and venom. "Sign the deal, Liam," Rachel said, sliding papers across the table. "Marry me or this company sinks." The room went quiet, lawyers shifting uncomfortably. Grace stepped forward, her voice shaky but clear. "I've got something to say." Liam looked up, surprised. "Grace, what are you doing?" Rachel smirked. "Oh, the coffee girl's back. This should be good." Grace ignored her, plugging the USB into a laptop. "Just listen," she said, hitting play. The audio crackled to life. Rachel's voice filled the room, smug and careless from that night at the coffee shop. "Liam's a means to an end," she'd told the client. "I don't love him, never did. He's just a stepping stone to the top. Once I've got what I want, I'm out." The lawyers froze. Liam's eyes widened, then narrowed. Rachel's face drained of color. "That's fake," she snapped, lunging for the laptop. Grace yanked it back. "It's real, and you know it. I was there mopping the floor while you laughed about using him." The room erupted. Lawyers scribbled notes. Rachel shouted about privacy laws, but Grace stood her ground. "You can't bully him into this," she said, turning to Liam. "You don't deserve that." He stared at her, his expression unreadable at first, then softening. "Grace," he said, standing, "you didn't have to do this." She swallowed hard. "Yeah, I did. I'm not letting her take you away, not when I just found you." Rachel glared, venom in her eyes. "You think this changes anything? I'll bury you both." But the lawyers were already shaking their heads. The recording flipped the script, her leverage crumbling. Liam crossed the room, pulling Grace aside. "Where'd you get that?" he asked, voice low. "I didn't even know I had it," she admitted. "I found it last night going through old stuff. I couldn't let her win." He looked at her, rain still drying on her hair from the night before, and felt his chest tighten. "You're incredible," he said. Grace blushed. "I'm just stubborn. And maybe a little crazy." He smiled, that rare, real smile she loved. "Good thing I like crazy." Rachel wasn't done fighting. She stormed out, vowing revenge. But the damage was hers to bear. The board called an emergency meeting, and with the recording, they ruled her contract claim baseless. It was a power play, not a legal right. Liam watched her leave, a weight lifting he hadn't known he carried. Grace stayed close, her hand brushing his as they stood by his office window. "I thought I'd lose you," she said quietly, to her, to all this. He turned, taking her face in his hands. "You fought for me, Grace. No one's ever done that." She looked up, eyes bright. "I've never had anything worth fighting for until now. You make me feel like I'm more than my mistakes." Liam's thumb traced her cheek. "You are. You're everything I didn't know I was missing." They stood there, city lights flickering below, and he pulled her into a kiss, soft but fierce, like he'd been holding it back too long. Grace melted into him, her fears fading with every second. "I'm not good at this," she murmured against his lips. "Love, trust, any of it." He pulled back, smiling. "We'll figure it out together." Later, they sat on his office couch, sharing a coffee she'd made, terrible but theirs. Grace leaned into him, her voice small. "I was so scared, Liam. Scared she'd take you. Scared I'd ruin everything like I always do." He wrapped an arm around her. "You didn't ruin anything. You saved me, Grace. From her, from myself." She looked at him, really looked, and saw the man beneath the suit. The one who'd been hurt, who'd built walls she was tearing down. "I don't know how to be enough for you," she said. He kissed her forehead. "You already are. Just keep being you." The fight wasn't over, not completely. Rachel's threats lingered, but Grace felt stronger now. She'd faced her down, not with money or power, but with truth and heart. I'm not running anymore, she thought, resting against Liam. This is my place, messy as it is. And Liam, holding her close, knew he'd never let her go. She'd broken through his armor, not with a crash, but with quiet, stubborn love. And he'd spend every day proving she was worth it. Grace Mitchell and Liam Donovan had weathered the storm. Rachel Hayes was gone, her threats empty, her power broken by Grace's courage and that fateful recording. The office buzzed with relief, but for Grace and Liam, it was more than a victory over a rival. It was a beginning. They'd found each other in the chaos, two broken pieces fitting together in ways neither expected. Days turned to weeks, and Grace settled into her role at Donovan Ventures. Still clumsy, still herself, but now with Liam's quiet strength beside her. He'd catch her when she tripped, laugh at her terrible coffee, and every time, she'd see it in his eyes. He was hers, and she was his. Liam knew it was time. He'd spent years chasing success, locking his heart away after Rachel's betrayal, but Grace had changed everything. She wasn't just a spark, she was a fire, warming parts of him he'd thought were cold forever. He wanted her for keeps, not as a fling or a moment, but as his life. One night he sat in his office, sketching a plan. No grand gestures, no diamond the size of her fist. Grace didn't need that. She needed real, and he'd give her that. He called in a favor, bought Brew and Bloom from its old owner, and turned it into something new, a community coffee spot where anyone could belong. Then he got to work. The next morning, Grace arrived at the old shop, confused by Liam's text, "Meet me where it started." The sign still read Brew and Bloom, but inside, it glowed. Fairy lights hung from the ceiling, wooden tables held jars of wildflowers, and the air smelled like coffee and cinnamon. Grace stepped in, her sneakers squeaking, and saw Liam in the middle, no suit, just a sweater and jeans. Around him, trays of muffins, lumpy and burnt at the edges, spelled out, "Marry me," in frosting. She gasped, dropping her bag. "Is this a joke?" she asked, her voice trembling. Liam grinned, nervous but sure. "No joke, Grace. It's us." He walked to her, taking her hands. "You spilled coffee on me right here," he said, nodding at the counter. "You broke my walls, my rules, my heart, and I've never been happier. You're messy and stubborn and perfect, and I want you with me every day, spilling stuff, burning muffins, all of it." Grace's eyes welled up, a laugh bubbling out. "You're crazy," she said. He pulled a ring from his pocket, simple silver with a tiny green stone, like the apron she'd worn that first day. "Crazy about you. Grace Mitchell, will you marry me?" She stared at him, then at the muffins, and threw her arms around him. "Yes, Liam, yes, but you're cleaning up the frosting." He laughed, spinning her around, and kissed her, sweet and deep under the lights. The wedding came fast because Grace didn't want fuss. They picked a park near Brew and Bloom with trees and a pond, simple and free. Grace wore a white sundress she'd found second-hand, her hair loose with a daisy tucked in. Liam stood at a wooden arch in a light gray suit, no tie, his smile wide as she walked to him barefoot, grass staining her feet. Friends from the office cheered, and a few Seattle regulars clapped, holding coffee cups she'd once filled. The officiant asked, "Grace, do you take Liam?" She grabbed the mic, grinning. "I do, because he saw me when I was invisible, loved me when I was a mess, and I'll spill coffee on him forever." Liam took her hand, his turn. "I do, Grace, because you showed me life isn't about control. It's about this, us, the mess, and the love. I'll catch you every time you fall." They kissed, long and soft, the crowd whooping as petals rained down. The reception was pure grace. Picnic tables, a playlist of old love songs, and a cake she'd tried to bake herself, lopsided but delicious. Liam cut it with her, smearing frosting on her nose, and she laughed, pulling him onto the grass to dance. "You're stuck with me now," she teased. "Good," he said, holding her close. "That's all I want." Later, they sat by the pond, her head on his shoulder, the sun dipping low. "I never thought I'd get this," Grace said, voice quiet. "A guy like you? A day like this? I was just the girl who messed up." Liam tilted her chin up. "You're the girl who fixed me, Grace. I was lost until you." She smiled, eyes shining. "We fixed each other, huh?" He nodded, kissing her again, the world fading to just them. Brew and Bloom glowed in the distance, their start, their home, a promise of more messy, beautiful days ahead. Here's the seventh and final part of the script for the video The Barista Who Broke the Billionaire's Heart, corresponding to the conclusion and call to action section. This part wraps up the story with a sweet, inspiring note and engages the audience, as per your outline. It's in English, no special characters, adheres to the outline, and includes the word count. And so, Grace Mitchell and Liam Donovan found their forever, not in a perfect fairy tale, but in a love built from spilled coffee, burnt muffins, and unbreakable trust. They proved that it doesn't matter where you start, a tiny coffee shop or a towering skyscraper, love finds a way when it's real. Grace went from thinking she was invisible to shining in Liam's world, and Liam learned that the heart he'd locked away was worth opening again. Together, they turned chaos into something beautiful, a reminder that the best things in life aren't planned, they're felt. What did you think of their story? On a scale from 0 to 10, how would you rate it? Drop your score in the comments below and let me know your favorite moment. Maybe the coffee spill, the proposal, or that messy wedding dance. Oh, and if you've made it this far, type coffee in the comments, just for fun. I'll know you're one of the true romantics who stuck with Grace and Liam to the end. If this tale warmed your heart, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Emma's Stories. Hit that bell so you never miss another journey of love, laughter, and maybe a little drama. We've got more stories coming your way, tales of ordinary people finding extraordinary love, just like Grace and Liam. Check out the video on your screen next for another heart-tugging adventure. Thanks for watching, you amazing dreamers, and I'll see you in the next one. Keep believing in love, because sometimes all it takes is a spilled cup to find your forever. Bye for now.